Right, so I am Jon Stotts. I'm the Director of Adult Faith Formation here at Christ the King, for those of you who don't know me. And welcome. We're going to spend 5 weeks at the most, maybe 1 week, if good enough, talking about the desert fathers and mothers, early Christian dwellers in the desert, who had a tremendous influence on not only the spirituality of the Christian traditions, both West and East, but also on what Christendom would become, how church and empire would dance together for the ensuing centuries. And there's much to learn from them. So I'm excited to get right in. Today will be a broad overview. Everything we touch on today will be touched on again in slightly more depth over the next 4 weeks. Next week will be more history than in the 3 weeks after that. So if you like history, next week you're gonna love, because we're gonna look at Constantine and other emperors and lots of dates and things like that to kind of set the context. It won't be dry, I hope. But we really want to bring the world to life, both the political, the economic, and the religious world of what's known as the time of late antiquity. And then the 3 weeks after that, we'll be unpacking some of the spiritual themes that we encounter, though hopefully we'll be doing that all along. First, the relationship developed between these desert dwellers and their neighbors, both other desert dwellers and people who came to visit them, so looking at themes of hospitality and relationship and what that has to teach us. Then we're going to look at thoughts. What do you do when all you're doing is sitting around doing nothing? Well, you have to deal with the stream of thoughts, and so there is an elaborate tradition that emerges, for instance, into Dante's Deadly Sins. There's an elaborate tradition of how to deal with thoughts and how to categorize them and find out what they're telling us about our union with God. So we'll look at that. And then in the final week, really, we'll just wrap up. But we'll ask, what does it mean to be saved according to these early Christians? And how does that challenge our notions of what it is that we're doing here? But really, it'll just be kind of a mop-up. And if I don't cover all the material here, we'll just push it back, and we'll fill our time. So with a quick show of hands, if you have ever encountered a desert father or mother in literature, I assume no one has encountered them. They're long dead. But if you are somewhat familiar with this, if your familiarity is more than what? Show of hands. Good. If this is your first foray into this material, that's great. You're going to learn a ton. If it isn't, I think we still have something to learn, either from reflecting on some of their sayings, which we'll do plenty of, but also, hopefully, I'll be able to provide some background information, some historical context that will bring these people to life in maybe a way that you haven't encountered. That's my hope anyway. So, without further ado, I want to start with this person, Melania the Elder, who died in the early 5th century. So to set the scene, the Roman Empire, which stretches from the Latin West to India, truly. And the heart of the empire really was in the east. We'll talk more about that. A time of tremendous economic wealth, of law, of sort of a very philosophical paganism, is encountering Christianity as it begins to emerge in the mainstream. And that narrative is one that we'll talk a lot about, because the desert fathers and mothers, they help to mediate this exchange as the empire becomes more Christian, but also as the church becomes more imperial in a lot of ways. And these men and women really are mediators. We see in them sort of, if you think of a seismograph, they're the peaks and the valleys of what's going on everywhere. So they give us a real sense of what's happening to sort of everyday folks. So at age 22, Melania was one of the wealthiest women in the Roman Empire. She was also a widow at the age of 22. She was born in Spain, an aristocrat, and she had vast estates throughout Gaul, and she'd seen a lot of tragedies. Obviously a widow, she also lost 2 sons and had endured a string of miscarriages. So this is a woman who had already experienced life. When her husband, who was a prefect of Rome, so a big guy, when she died, she decided not to marry again. She's done with this. She gathered all of the wealth that she could carry, all the portable stuff. She got in a ship, and she went to Alexandria, Egypt, which at the time was kind of the New York City of the Roman Empire. If you've ever been to NYC or you know people from there, they don't associate with the rest of New York, right? They're a land unto themselves. So too with Alexandria, a land of tremendous wealth, because it had connections to the breadbasket, the Nile, but also philosophical learning. The great library was there. An amazing lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, which is no longer existent, was in Alexandria. So she went, and she got a warm welcome because she was widely known for her wealth. But she decided to do a little spiritual tourism. So set off, she found a guide, and she went into the desert. So a 22-year-old widow, lots of wealth. Her caravan, her guide, she goes into the desert. She wanted to see some people that she'd heard about. Some people living in the desert, doing God knows what out there. But there were stories, miracles, tremendous wisdom to be gained, and maybe something just to fill the aching loneliness that, not 3 decades into her life she had begun to feel. So she went into the desert. And she went to Nitria, which was a city of monks. We'll look at some archaeological stuff there. But it was a city of monks perched just on the edge of the desert. And she met one of the most famous of the desert fathers at the time, Abba Pombo. And she decided to make their relationship, honest in the best way that she could. She gave him a lot of money. She unloaded her silver. So she found this man, this famous monk, and he's sitting weaving a rope out of leaves. He kind of looked up at her and gave her a nod and went back to work. And she directed her servants to begin unloading bags, boxes, I don't know how one carries silver, but just unloads it. And he sees it, gives her another nod, and tells some monks to start delivering it to other monasteries. Doesn't say another word to her. And she is miffed. She's used to effusive praise. When she landed in Alexandria, there were crowds to wave and to get some money. And so she was a little bit hurt. She'd come all this way to see this man, and he just sort of acknowledges her presence barely. And she goes up to him and she says, "You should know there are more than 300 pounds of silver there," in case he hadn't noticed. And he finally looked up at her and he said, if you're talking to me, if it's for me, then you've spoken well. But if this is for God, he'd prefer your silence. He knows how much money is there. So you ought to be quiet. This is not the way one speaks to one's superiors in the societal ladder. But later on, she would tell her biographer, later on, after she had founded one of the most powerful monasteries in Jerusalem, her granddaughter would go on, Melania the Elder, very creative, the names here, would go on to be a very famous spiritual guide and writer. She would tell her biography, "That's when the Lord showed me his power." That's when the Lord showed me his power. What power was that? The power to look at a mountain of money and go back to weeping. The power to look at a possible benefactor and to go back and to not worry about it. This impressed her. So who were these people? Scattered throughout North Africa, Palestine, and Syria. We're going to spend the next several weeks getting to know them well. But before we continue, I want to sort of set the spiritual tone for what we're doing, because these people did not invent this spiritual life. So this gospel reading, we'll return to it every week. And I hope that our discussion of the fathers and mothers helps us to unpack some of the meaning here. This is my favorite of our Lenten readings. We didn't read it this year. But this is the Gospel according to St. Mark. Jim, would you mind reading it to us?
Can't see it.
Okay. That will make it harder. Better?
And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. And as he was coming up out of the water, he immediately saw the heavens being ripped apart, and the Spirit, like a dove, descending upon him. And a voice came out of the heavens, "You are my beloved Son, in you I have taken delight." And immediately the Spirit cast him out into the wilderness. And he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tested by Satan. And he was with wild animals, and angels were serving him.
Thank you. What was he doing out there? What was Jesus doing out in the desert? How did he fill his time? In a lot of ways, what these desert mothers and fathers did was to go out and try to figure that out, to assume that the Spirit they'd been given in their baptism would help to guide them as they went and they did what Jesus did after he was baptized, which was nothing, right? Which was to try to tame the desert. We're told that Jesus was with the wild animals. We don't know in what manner he was with them, fending them off with a stick, or is he befriending these hyenas after they try to eat him? And angels, Mark tells us, angels were serving him. So here is Jesus in the midst of beasts and angels being tempted by this evil spirit. And for these early Christians, and I think for us, this gives us an image not just of Lent, but of what human life is. In between the angels, the better angels of our nature, and the beasts, the ones who just want to ravage and prowl and take what's there, with temptation misleading us. And we have to make our way here. We have to dwell here. And I think that we find with these desert fathers and mothers, and what we'll go on to find, is that there are two different deserts we have to contend with. There's the external desert, Melania's desert, widowed at 22, losing 2 children and more. There's that desert, a social desert. And then there's also the internal desert, right? What you do with that, what you do with your life. And so the question I think this poses for us that we'll continue to throw around is, how do we find the interior desert amidst the deserts of our lives? And how do we find a way to dwell with these beasts and with these angels? Because Jesus doesn't conquer any of them. He just learns to live there. And I think these fathers and mothers might be a guide. Okay, so we'll begin with a cursory definition. What is monasticism? What is a monk? When you hear the word monk, what do you think of? Images, words, experiences? Silence. Okay. Robes. Yes. What color? Brown. Okay. Sandals. Okay.
Removed from our daily life.
Okay, removed from us. So they're not here. You know, they're doing this. They don't have to come and learn about it. Yeah. Maureen. Chanting. Okay. So some singing, some chanting, some praying. Okay. Okay. Work.
Like work on the land.
Okay. Anyone else associate work with monks? Anyone else definitely not associate work, hard work, like labor, with monks? So this is interesting. We'll get into this. But largely, all of our associations would hold true for the founders or the origins of early monasticism, early monks. That is, simple garb, singing or chanting, work, silence, being alone. So we're gonna do a lot of historical thinking here, and one of the questions we can ask is, where did monasticism come from? And we'll talk about that. And also, how do we learn from monks, not being monks ourselves? And what we'll find is that with these folks, the difference between a monk and a not monk is all a matter of perspective. It's all a matter of, there's no religious orders one takes on. There are no promises one makes. The church doesn't come to recognize the existence of monastic orders for a long time. So it's simply what you happen to be doing with your time is what distinguishes you as a monk or not. But the word itself is a very simple word. It means solitary. It means alone. Right? Monos. Mono. Somebody help me out here.
Mononucleosis?
Yes. I'm so sorry. Yes. Like the dreaded kissing disease. Which one does not get alone, so I don't know why they call it that. So mono, coming from alone. We'll also hear the word hermit. Hermit from eremos, or the desert, a desert dweller. We'll also hear anchorite, which comes from the Greek word anchorein, to run away from, to flee. But mostly we'll talk about monks. This is Serapion, one of the only existing skeletons that we have of these folks. Looks comfy. And this is the motto of the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And we'll see its connection to this gospel reading. A brother came to Scetus to visit Abba Moses and asked him for a word. The old man said to him, "Go into your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." Go into your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. If you were to spend a day in a tiny room with nothing, maybe some water in case you get thirsty, what do you think you would learn? Say sun up to sundown. What would you learn? Carol?
A lot of crazy stuff in my head.
Okay, you would begin to get acquainted with, but surely you could just tell it to go away. Just say, quiet, I'm trying to pray. If you were to spend 12 hours in a room alone, no books, just you, what would you learn?
You can't go anywhere.
You're there.
You'd probably learn how bad your bathroom breaks smell.
Okay, yeah, maybe you can go out for the bathroom.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you for being utterly concrete. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Anyone want to try this? Mary Jo.
I would learn how exhausted or tired I was. Because I probably would start sleeping a lot.
Yes, in fact, that 12 hours could pass by very quickly because we would just fall asleep. But eventually we'd have enough sleep and we would have to deal with the task of being alone with ourselves. And that was the task of these mothers and fathers. So this man went away with this wisdom. How am I going to learn everything? I'm just going to go and be alone in my cell. And what these men and women learned, it's varied, right? There's no systematic wisdom. They learn lots of things. And some of them are lessons that we might need to learn, and some of them definitely are not. And so part of the task, as we look at some of the sayings, which we'll do in a few minutes, is to sift through them. Because we may not be this brother. We may be someone else, and we may need a different word. So what was monasticism? We've already talked about some of the associations. But we see, in broad strokes, things that still exist today, some form of asceticism, which is a fancy word that really means spiritual athleticism. So a striving, a hard work of the spiritual kind. Liturgical prayer. That is, prayer at set times. This emerged very early on. These men and women would have prayed the Psalms. Sometimes in community, sometimes on their own. But their days were punctuated by times of stopping what they were doing, or not, sometimes, and praying through the Psalms. Meditation on biblical texts. This is where the practice of Lectio Divina was invented. of just taking a very small bit of scripture, and that's what you're going to do for your 12 hours in your cell. You're going to think about, go sell everything that you have and follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven. For 12 hours, that's what you're going to do. Leadership based on spiritual authority. That is, authority that is recognized, charismatic authority, not authority that you are told, this person has authority, you must listen to them, but authority that emerges. And we'll see in this world, the authority of the holy man or woman is paramount. We see a movement away from a more polytheistic pagan emphasis on the holiness of places, like temples or groves, and holiness, and especially Christian holiness, becomes to be associated not with churches and not with an office like that of a bishop or a priest, but of a spiritually alive person to varying degrees. And so to have a relationship with a holy man or a holy woman, that is the sign that God is dwelling among us, that God has not withdrawn God's grace, but has put it in someone. A very incarnational theology. Manual labor. Work with one's hands. A clear belief in St. Paul's adage, if you're not going to work, you're not going to eat. Especially as we look at Egypt, which will be the focus of our conversation. These men and women earned money by making stuff and selling. Simple stuff. Stuff that they could do while they were praying. But they were part of the material economy of the local villages, or even the villages far away, of caravans, of ships taking their goods. They participated in human economy, as opposed, as we'll see, to the wandering monks of Syria who relied on alms, who relied on people to give them things because of their sort of charismatic holiness. Not so in Egypt. And that will play a crucial role in how religious life develops in Europe, especially. A focus on work and not on what would eventually come to be known as sort of mendicantism or the Franciscan movement, which is very much not about this. Adherence to a rule. Eventually, some of these monks want to live alone together. But to live alone together, you have to agree on some basics. And so some literate monks began writing down some rules. Here's how we're going to live. Here's when we're going to wake up. Here's what we do when this happens. Some of them are very rigid. Some of them are very lax. Some of them stand the test of time. Some of them definitely don't. But we see an acknowledgement that we need some kind of order and discipline, probably under the spiritual headship of someone. And so we have the emergence of these rules of life. And then finally, community. Ironically, the desire to be alone, the desire to seek God, brought people into a new kind of relationship that hadn't been seen in many places in the empire. A relationship that was not based on social status or wealth, or even spiritual status or wealth, but simply the notion that we were all equals standing before God, trying to live together, alone together. And this too would go on to influence the way that Christians would think about what it is that church does when church is gathering together. Thoughts or questions? Lots more to do. John?
I didn't comment the very first moment you started this, but I mean, is this arising from that followers which Jesus Christ started on the earth? I mean, I'm not sure. I want to try to see a little bit of where they came from, where they rose from.
It's a great question because we haven't gotten to it, and that's what's next. The origins and the spread.
Good segue.
That was great. We planned it. We talked earlier. So, in terms of our timeline, we're in the 300s, the early 300s. There have been periods of sporadic persecution and relative peace that have sprung up in the Christian churches throughout the Near East. Christianity has taken root in the larger urban areas. There is a church in most big towns. And again, from time to time, there are persecutions, though empire-wide persecution rarely happens. Christianity is diverse. It is more appropriate to talk about the churches, the traditions. There's no single liturgy. There's no single canon of Scripture. There's no single anything other than a single profession of Jesus, who is Lord and Savior, of the Spirit who dwells in us, of sacraments like Eucharist and baptism, and largely those two. But if you were to travel from Egypt into Turkey, you would see, and then even into Rome, you would see a very distinctive diversity in Christian practices. Though everyone would be speaking and worshiping in Greek for the most part. Even the Syrians knew how to speak Greek. And the heart of it all was in this area. The Italian peninsula was the Wild West. It was a backwoods. The Roman bishop there doesn't get invited to councils because he probably doesn't speak Greek. So that is a frontier. The heart of the empire really is the Near East, especially Alexandria, which linked the breadbasket of the Nile in northern Africa to the Mediterranean, where ships could take grain, silver, spices, anywhere they needed to go. Beginning in the late 200s, Christians saw Western society, that is, the Near East, beginning to be more hospitable to Christian thought and practice, despite periods of persecution. Oftentimes, these periods of persecution were created by people who were a little bit disturbed by how amenable Christians were to living in pagan society, and vice versa. So by the time you needed a persecution, it's because we were all getting a little too close. Christian thinkers and leaders were becoming more hospitable to the structures of Roman law. Figures like Origen were widely read in pagan philosophy. Read Plato. And people were beginning to celebrate the sort of urbane religious mixture of Christianity and Roman Empire, and tremendous economic wealth. This was a time of prosperity. This was not a time when tremendous amounts of people were on the streets poor. But as this happened, and especially as Constantine, who we'll talk about at length next week, less so, as Constantine made Christianity a legal possibility for people, and more, made it appealing through his own conversion. And we have to remember, by the time of his death, Christianity was no more than 10% of the population of this world. A true minority. But it became more and more popular politically. As this happened, certain men and women felt differently. Certain men and women saw the sort of blend of Western Latin education, as with the young Augustine, or other more urbane forms of politics, of social status, of the games that we play when we're an elite, or just the normal economic life of you're a farmer, you're going to inherit the farm, you're going to marry this person, you're going to have lots of kids, and you're going to live this life. From time to time you'll be summoned to public office, you'll have to do your stuff. Just normal life. Certain people looked at this and they read the Gospels and they said, no, that's not what we're doing. They would read the Gospel of Mark or hear it and think, that's not what Jesus was doing. That's not what the disciples were doing. So how do we do this? How do we do this? They sought to break with civilized life. And that means economic prosperity, or at least getting by, but in a lot of times, economic prosperity, social status, an educational system that was actually pretty darn good if you were literate, and all the norms and obligations that comes with taking on a trade, and marrying, and having kids, and living in society. They saw this, what many of us, well, all of us have here, and they said, the gospel can't speak to this way of life. We can't make it work. So let's find a way of life that fits with what we're reading, what we're hearing. And so for several centuries, this spiritual athleticism, this asceticism, it dominated the popular imagination through written biographies of people like St. Anthony the Great, through stories, even through sort of spiritual tourism, going into the desert to see these people and coming away with a sense of having seen someone really powerful. It would leave its mark on the Christian Near East. Though these breaks with society happened throughout here, there were two areas where they were immensely popular. Syria in the Syrian desert here, and Alexandria, and largely Egypt along the Nile here. And they took two very different forms, and the one that emerged was maybe the more surprising one. The Syrians were probably the most flamboyant of the monastic movement. These people went into the desert not to sit and work, but to wander, to heckle, to preach. They were filled with passion. They looked crazy. They would spike up their hair and wear, animal skins. Think John the Baptist, or imitators of John the Baptist. They were not afraid to astound people with truly dramatic behavior. By the 5th century, the most well-known representative of the Syrian monks was the stylite, or the pole or column dwellers. These monks would live on tall columns, and they would stay there. They would yell at people as they walked by or preach. The most famous of these, Simon the Stylite, that's his Instagram selfie right there. He was known for holding court for decades. People would just go to him and he would talk to them, but he would live up there, lower a basket for food and water. I don't know about the bathroom situation. I'm afraid to ask just how he did that. A 50-foot column. Okay, so this is dramatic, and it conveys a sense of drama. And these men and women, even if they weren't living on top of poles, they would wander, they would preach, and they would rely on other people to give them money, which tells us a lot about society in Syria. It was prosperous. You can only live as a beggar if people have enough to give, right? And these people survived. They did okay. There was a spiritual transaction going on. I'm going to give you, crazy religious person, some money, and you're going to pray for me. You're going to have my back spiritually. We like having them around because they're a sign that God is among us. Not what I would do, but maybe not too far either. These men were often, and women were often known as angels because they wanted to break with society and they didn't want to work. Right? And this was key. They didn't want to work anymore. They thought that they wanted to return to Eden before the curse that made us have to work with our hands by the sweat of our brow. So these angels gave up work and took on spiritual labor, the labor of the angels, to pray, to preach, to do these kinds of things. But to work was to descend back into the fallen world, and they didn't want to do that. And so by the largesse of their local communities, they didn't have to. They were angels.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Given their reliance on benefactors who would come out to speak with them, I'm assuming that there's some sort of tension between them saying, like, I'm actually living a higher, an Edenic form of life, a new creation form of life. I'm not working. But yet I rely on people who do work to come in and listen to me talk about why you shouldn't work. So how, do you have any, or maybe you'll get to that later, but what was that interchange like? Like people giving you money for potentially critiquing the form of life that they live?
Yeah. First of all, they probably didn't talk about it. That is, they didn't take the step back and say, what are we doing here? Like these, we're in the midst of this. And this still happens. We have people come here and, they preach and ask us for money and we give it to them. And we don't really think about that exchange. It just sort of takes place. And these wandering monks were popular enough to the imagination that there was a sense, first of all, this was not a sense of who was saved, right? This isn't a sort of spiritual elitism that says these people, maybe sometimes, but it was recognizing that God has come to us in the form of these wanderers, and they could be angels, so we give to them. So the spiritual vision was not adversarial, I would put it that way. But also, this is not a time when there was a lot of reflection on what this meant for society. It's a good question, but it's one that we're asking that they wouldn't necessarily have been asking. Contrast. Egypt. It's a little subtler. The desert monks of the Egyptian desert, redundant, the monks of the Egyptian desert were largely peasants. Sometimes well-to-do peasants, but they were They were poor people. And they didn't want dramatic individualism like their Syrian counterparts. They wanted to leave society with a little humility. They stayed in contact with others often. And as I've already mentioned, they spent their time working. They prayed through their work and in their work. But unlike the Syrian wanderers, the angels, they did not seek to leave the fallen world. They stayed in contact with it, and they continued to have economic transactions, to have relationships with caravanners, with people who would buy their baskets or the ropes or the papyri or whatever it was that they were making. And so even though they were withdrawing, the material circumstances that they, in fact, kept alive ensured that they stayed related to society. This was not a complete withdrawal. So 2 examples. Son of a well-to-do family of farming peasants, sees his parents die and inherits about 200 acres in the expectation that he would go on farming it in a little village along the Nile. But one day, he goes to church and he hears the gospel. Go, sell all you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And strangely enough, he hears this as being directed to him and not someone else. He hasn't yet learned the skill of hearing that that's definitely for someone else, not me. He hears this. And so he moves to the outskirts of the city, he sells everything he has, and starts living alone. But he attracts a little attention. You know, we know you. Why are you doing this? Aren't you supposed to be taking up the family farm? So he gradually moves farther and farther out into the desert, finding a place in the outer desert around here, around 285 AD. He dies in 356. He's at the age of 105. He's lived in the desert that whole time. 70 years he's lived there. Weeks away from the nearest town. He wove some baskets, he said some prayers, and he stayed away from everyone. And yet, do you know who the father of monasticism is? St. Anthony the Great. This young man. His biographer was none other than the 4th century Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, who we had the occasion to meet once or twice when he actually went back to Alexandria to defend the exiled bishop against the Arians. We'll talk more about that a little bit next week. This biography became a bestseller. Everyone was reading it. And St. Anthony became the face of the desert for these people. And this is available online. It's worth a read. It's long, so I didn't print it out. But if you read the life of St. Anthony, it's quite dramatic. It's lovely. He fights with a lot of demons. He says a lot of cool stuff. And then somehow, the Roman world, which prized rhetors like Cicero, Christian thinkers like the later Augustine who could write in the Latin style, Greek philosophy, Plotinus at this time is sort of redoing Plato for the smartest people in the world. This is a world that prized education, and somehow a peasant who did not go to school captures the imagination of Christianity and provides an alternative to public schooling or private schooling, some other way to live the Christian life. And even Augustine would become obsessed with these desert dwellers. Another example, another farmer who was gang-pressed into Constantine's army, was discharged from service, and he became a Christian. He heard about Anthony, and so he wandered out into the desert and found some random hermit to learn from. Teach me what you're doing. I'm done with this way of life. And he sets out on his own after he learns enough and lives by himself. But then he hears a voice saying, you should be alone together with someone. Go be alone together. And so he builds a dwelling for more hermits to come. And Pachomius, as his name was, he created the first, or one of the first great organized communities of people living alone, of monks, taking hermits who lived by themselves and linking them into settlements with ingenuity of like a Roman soldier, which he in fact was, with a rule of life that helped them to amass pretty tremendous wealth, which they subsequently gave away. And by the end of the 4th century, these monastic communities numbered around 7,000 monks. They were, as one spiritual writer called them, cities in the desert. They made the desert into a city. The rule of Pachomius would spread until someone named Benedict would read it and think, oh, this is a good idea, I just need to tweak it. And I'll write my own rule with some other sources. And that rule, the rule of St. Benedict, will go on and have a tremendous influence on our own society. From someone who just went into the desert to pray. So men and women went out into the desert. And these crosses show where famous hermits or monastic communities developed all along the Nile, the Arabian Peninsula here, famous one on Sinai, and in Syria. Some of them lived alone. Others settled in communities and lived according to some mutually agreed upon rule. They spent their time in prayer, but in North Africa, where we'll focus, prayer for them did not mean saying prayers. Right? They were doing this while they weaved, while they spoke, while they eat, while they didn't eat. Whatever they were doing while they were prayer, it was compatible with life, with living, with work. Weaving baskets, making rope, making rugs, and working hard. These were hard workers. Primary place of interest is Scetis. It was founded around 330 by Macarius the Great. He's kind of a wily spiritual advisor. This region is known as the Great Desert. And the name Scetis comes from the Coptic shehet, which means to weigh the heart. That's what they were busy doing. They were weighing the heart, which is actually a fascinating notion if you know Egyptian mythology. According to the lore of Egypt, when everybody dies, your heart is weighed according to a feather. And if you owe a balance, I think you're devoured by angry crocodile gods. So they're weighing the heart. They're probing its depths. This place is in a vast wilderness, to give you kind of an image of where these people were living. A day and night's journey from another important settlement, Nitria. And you could only get to it if you knew how to navigate by the stars. People were lost trying to get there. So when these monks said they wanted to be alone, they made it as hard as possible for would-be benefactors and spiritual tourists to make it there. You had to really want to. Water was hard to find, and when you found it, it smelled bad. It was a stinky place, and they liked it that way. They liked it that way. So here is what Scetis probably looked like from above. Each of these would have been a cell, a 2-room dwelling, where monks could live within eyeshot of one another, but far enough apart that they weren't bothering one another. So this is more like a monastic settlement. Don't think monastery, like a single building that these men and women are living in. They would live in small mud brick huts, pretty easy to make in the hot sun. You get some mud and you let it dry. So a spiritual elder or abbot might gather his disciples and could build a cell in a single day if someone new showed up. Many of the cells were caves or small bungalows. You could find a rock face and kind of build an outcropping around it. Here are some that we know were monastic settlements. Many cells had 2 rooms. You had your prayer room, and then you had a place where you would entertain guests, cook your food and work, etc. Abba Isaac complained that some of the monks were getting ahead of themselves. They'd build cells with 4 or 5 rooms, furnished with rugs and things, which was a little bit scandalous. They'd sit on mats during the day, sleep on them at night. They might have small stools woven from papyrus stalks. So anything they could make by their hands, they could probably keep. And if they slept, they would use those stools as a headrest or their mats. They spent most of their time doing labor, day in and day out. Usually, because papyrus and reeds were everywhere, they would make ropes, make baskets. They'd get reeds from the nearby marshes and take them back. Sometimes they would take their handiwork to the market, which would involve a journey, or they would set up markets for caravanners to come and get. During harvest time, many of them went down the Nile to work on farms. So think of our immigrant farmers who come to the tomato fields to pick. These men and women were not afraid to work, and then they would go back. Even the greats, Macarius, John the Little, were known for just going to the field and working to make enough to live on and to stay honest. Diet was austere, maybe 2 small loaves of bread a day, about 1 pound's worth of bread. There was a kind of Egyptian bread that they would make that would keep for a long time, but it'd get harder and harder as the weeks went by, so you'd have to dip it in water to eat. And they seasoned it with salt so that they didn't die, because they are in the desert. When they could get olive oil, they might use it, but sparingly. There's some mention of vegetables, but those would have been rare. Largely, this was a diet of bread, unless there were guests. And when guests came, they would cook anything that they have and prepare a feast. Hospitality in the desert, which is a long desert tradition. If you know of the Bedouin, for example, guests are to be treated with the highest honor. So however austere a desert dweller's diet was, if someone comes, you give them everything you have and more. But largely, this looked like the diet of peasants, of poor people. This is Nitria, another monastic settlement. Here we have slightly larger domiciles. We have reports of 5,000 people living here at one time, which is a lot. And the monks of Nitria also produced wine. They could grow grapes, and so they produced wine for profit, cultivated gardens, and sold the produce. Okay, so how do we know all this? We have lots of sources, but here we'll be focusing on Egypt largely, and specifically a collection known as the Apophthegmata Patrum. Apophthegmata, which I prefer to say rather than what it means, which is saying, something that is spoken. Apophthegmata Patra, are the sayings of the fathers and mothers. This collection probably was finalized in Palestine, but it was collected largely from the monks, the men and women of the Egyptian desert, by ascetic travelers, pilgrims, spiritual tourists. And these were a remarkable new literary genre. In a world that prized speeches, written down or spoken, these were pithy sayings. And these were wisdom collected by uneducated peasants, not by the educated elite. And they became tremendously popular. We have 2 collections. We have an alphabetic collection of around 1,000 sayings. Alphabetic because it's organized by the person to whom it's attributed. This is the best edition, Benedict Award. It's old and it's still the best. And then there's a systematic collection with a few more sayings organized according to theme. Lots of overlap between them. We'll be focusing on this. And they're short, simple stories. They usually open with something like, one day a brother went to Abba so-and-so and asked this question, and then he said this. The end. Right? They're pithy. They're meant to be carried away and chewed on. For instance, here's a longer one. A brother came to see Abba Macarius the Egyptian and said to him, Abba, give me a word that I may be saved. Right, so tell me something. Give me your wisdom so that I can be saved. So the old man said, go to the cemetery and abuse the dead. The brother went away, abused them, threw stones at them, and mocked them. Then he went back and told the old man about it, and he said, did they tell you anything? What did they say after you abused them, after you ridiculed them? And he said, they didn't say anything. He said, okay, go back tomorrow and instead of this time praise them. We'll see if that works. And so the kid goes back and he lavishes praise on them, calls them holy and saints, and praised all their works in life. And then goes back to Abba Macarius and reports what he did, and Abba Macarius says, and how did they answer? What did they have to say to your praise? And he said, they didn't say anything. They were dead. And the old man said to him, you know how you insulted them, and they didn't reply, and how you praised them, and they didn't reply. So if you too wish to be saved, you must be the same and become like a dead man. Like the dead, take no account either of the scorn or the praise of men, and you will be saved. So a little work, and then a little saying. Here's another. A brother came to Scetus to visit Abba Moses and asked him for a word. The old man said, "Go to your cell. Here, I'll make it for you out of mud. And your cell will teach you everything." A word of salvation is not meant for everyone. And this is the trick of these sayings. They are not meant for everyone. And we find our fair share of misogyny, which would be banal in the ancient world. We find views of the body that we will find tremendously uncomfortable, feats of spirituality that we don't think we're capable of, a distaste for food, which I don't get because I like food. But these were exchanges. One person went to one person and said, "Give me some wisdom that is good for me," and then he took it away and then reported it later. But I'm not going to tell you what my therapist said, and if I do, that may not be helpful for you. It really depends on the context. So as we look at these sayings, we really do have to consider whether it's for us. And that is that weighing the heart. Am I finding it repugnant because it's not for me, or because it is? Right? Do I not like this because I can't see the world in this way and it's not helpful, or because it's calling me to stretch a little bit? That's the trick. A brother renounced the world and gave his goods to the poor, but he kept back a little for his personal expenses. He went to see Abbot Anthony. When he told him this, the old man said to him, "If you want to be a monk, go into the village and buy some meat and cover your naked body with it. Come back here like that." So the brother did so, as one does, and the dogs and birds started chasing him down and trying to eat him. When he came back to the old man, Anthony asked him whether he'd followed the advice. He showed him all the bite marks, and Anthony said, "Those who renounce the world but want to keep something for themselves are torn in this way by the demons who make war on them." Oof. Or sometimes it's just a little statement. It was said of Abba Agathon that for 3 years he lived with a stone in his mouth till he had learned to keep silence. I got my kids some rocks this week. So there are thousands of these sayings, and it's our task to see what they have in common and to learn from them, which is what we'll be doing for the next couple of weeks. I'll save this for next week. I have some profiles of some of these famous men and some women. But at your tables, you have some sayings. And your homework this week, as you come back, is to read through these. I've tried to provide a variety of themes from a variety of the speakers. Read through them and see if one or two doesn't strike the imagination, doesn't kind of hit you and you think, "Oh, maybe I do need a stone." And imagine yourself going into the desert to find some spiritual elder and to say, "Abba," or "Amma," "Mommy," "Daddy, give me a word." And they give you this. And this is all you have. This is what you take with you to sort of think on and meditate. Because when you go back to that person, they're going to want to know, did you do what I told you? Did you think about it? And if you don't have anything to show for it, they're probably not going to talk to you. So this is the building of a relationship. These men and women who lived in the desert, they did not want to waste their time because they're busy. They're praying. We'll figure out what it is that they mean when they say they're praying, because it looks like they're just weaving baskets. But they really only want to have interactions that are advancing sort of the spiritual vision that they have. So they're going to test people in ways that, putting meat on your naked body and letting dogs bite you, I may not want to do that. But if I want Abba Moses to pay attention to me, or Anthony, I may have to do that. Sometimes they're insulting. These men and these women will insult those who come to them to see how someone will carry it. That may not work in our society. We may have to find different ways to sort of poke the ego. But it is a tremendous sign. If you want to live in the desert, you better be able to handle it when someone insults you, like the dead. So we'll look more at their lifestyle next week. And here's, again, a rundown of what the next couple weeks are going to look like. Next week, we'll talk more about the history involved here, and I'll answer more of John's question about just how it is that these men and women emerged. And my emphasis is going to be that while their stories encourage us, and the writers meant to do this, to see these men and women as being set apart, as being utterly different than, contrasting sharply with society, we're going to see them on a continuum. If it was possible for these men and women to do this, that tells us something about the society that they came from, and about the spirituality that is already trickling back into the cities and towns. So it's not just the desert dwellers that are practicing these kinds of things. They're just the ones that get books written about them. And we'll talk about Constantine Empire. We'll decide whether we want Constantine to have become a Christian or not together. In session 3, we'll talk about sort of how they related to one another, with these ambiguous relationships of love and hate, of statements that you should probably not care anything about anyone else, and also the sense that if you're not loving your brother or your sister, whatever you're doing in the desert isn't helpful. Session 4, we'll talk about thoughts and desires, and sort of the taxonomy developed, the 7 deadly thoughts or passions that emerge from this time. And then finally, we'll wrap up with what we take away. But all along, I want us to be using this not just to learn some history, though we will do this, but we're in the midst of Lent, into the first week of it, a time of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And this is where those practices came from. These men and these women dominated the Christian imagination and passed them on to men and women who become monks and nuns, who would teach our children and us. I think we do have something to learn, but it may be surprising what that is, because especially the Egyptian monks, the Egyptian men and women, again, they worked. They were part of society. They managed to hold on to their humanity without letting go of it, and also accomplish tremendous spiritual feats. Ours is a time when I think it is getting harder to live among our neighbors. We're polarized politically. We don't always get along with people. Mental illness is at an all-time high. We're dealing with people who are struggling with addiction, family members. We are developing as a society a desert, a true desert. Huge spaces in between us. Huge spaces in between parts of town. And I don't just mean geographically. And that, I think, is mirrored by an interior desert. People don't know what to do with themselves. We don't know what to do when we turn off Netflix and we just sit in our cells. We have to distract ourselves, sometimes with church, with retreats and things, and people who will talk to us and entertain us, and that's all good, and there's good to be gained. But these men and women will teach us what to do with the deserts inside of ourselves. And if we can find God there, if we can find God in the desert here, maybe we can find it in the space between us too. And maybe God won't look like an angel. Maybe sometimes God will look more like a wild beast. Or maybe just someone who's working, just like us, a fellow worker. So we're going to learn how to be alone together with these desert fathers and mothers. So come back next week. Thanks for being here. I have, in addition to the sayings, if you want additional reading, there are copies of Thomas Merton's introduction to his own collection, much shorter than the full one.
Is this the one that you had linked on your...
Yes. So you may have downloaded it. If you want additional reading, this is a really evocative sort of... he paints a good picture of what these men and women are doing. It's a little dated historically, and we'll deal with that next week. But if you've ever read Merton, he has a great way of writing. So this is a good introduction to everything that we talked about today. So you can pick that up, or it was on the weekly email. We'll see you back next week.